What does it take for a woman to be hanged like a dog, burned like a witch, or sold like furniture in the age of pirates? Law was written by kings, enforced by soldiers, and designed to punish men. But when a woman broke that world, when she took the wheel, raised the cutlass, and commanded a ship of outlaws, the law didn't just punish her, it stripped her name, shredded her body, and erased her from memory. This is not the story of pirates. It's the story of what happened after the shackles, after the courtroom, after the gallows. Because for women like Bonny, Mary Read, and Mary Critchett, death was never enough. They weren't just executed, they were displayed, whipped, sold, forgotten, and some were simply made to disappear. Today, we descend into the silence that followed the gunpowder, into the prisons, the ropes, and the rotting hulls. This is what happened to female pirates after the battle ended. Are you ready? The moment a female pirate was captured, her fate was sealed, not because of what she did, but because of what she was. British Admiralty courts in the 17th and 18th centuries were swift, brutal, and absolute. They weren't interested in fairness. They weren't even interested in facts. These were tribunals held in damp colonial ports like Jamaica or New Providence, often in makeshift courtrooms where there was no jury, no mercy, and no second chances. But if you were a woman, you weren't just a pirate. You were a problem that had to be erased. The law didn't know what to do with you, so it did everything. They called you unnatural. They said piracy was a man's crime and that a woman who dared to fight like one was a monster in disguise. Bonny and Mary Read were both sentenced to hang in 1720. But they had one advantage: they were pregnant, and in a rare legal loophole known as pleading the belly, they delayed their executions. Not out of compassion, but because the court didn't want to hang an unborn child. Mary Critchett wasn't so lucky. She was captured off the coast of Virginia in 1729. There was no plea, no defense, just a sentence, a rope, and a crowd eager to watch her die. The courtrooms weren't built for justice. They were built for punishment, for order, for example-making, and for cleansing the empire of anyone who stepped out of line, especially a woman with a sword. So when they stood before the judge, it wasn't a trial, it was theater, and the script always ended with silence. She wouldn't speak again, and if the empire had its way, no one would ever speak of her again. When the verdict was read, the punishment began not in the shadows, but in the streets. Execution dock, on the banks of the River Thames, was not a place for quiet justice. It was a stage, and the women sent there weren't being punished. They were being performed. From Newgate Prison, the condemned were paraded through London on wooden carts, surrounded by armed guards, priests, and jeering mobs. They didn't walk. They were rolled like cargo already dead in the eyes of the law. And, for a female pirate, the spectacle was twice as cruel. Men had hanged before, many, but a woman at the gallows. That was something rare, something thrilling, something grotesque. Mary Critchett was one of them. Captured near Virginia in 1729, she had joined a mutinous crew of escaped convicts turned pirates. When they were caught, the men were processed. She was paraded. No trial delay, no final speech, no mercy. At execution dock, the hanging wasn't quick. The British favored the short drop, a method of suspension that didn't snap the neck, but instead strangled the body slowly, leaving the victim twitching, gasping, sometimes for minutes. It was called the Marshal's Dance, a show, and in the case of a woman, a scandal worth watching. Clergy sometimes wept, children sometimes laughed, Sailors drank and cheered as her body convulsed, as her legs shook, as her face turned purple in the noonday sun. The rope didn't just kill, it humiliated. And when the twitching stopped, her punishment wasn't over. The worst offenders, often men. But sometimes women too were left hanging until the tide rose 3 times, washing over their feet, then their legs, then their waist. A grotesque baptism by sea, a ritual not of redemption, but of eradication. It told the world this one belonged to no one, not even to death. But it wasn't just about the body, it was about the message. These women were reminders, not of justice, but of control, of what happens when a woman claims the freedom of a man and dares to live outside her station. They weren't hanged because they killed. They were hanged because they commanded, because they led men, because they refused to apologize. The noose was the empire's way of tying things back into order. And when it was over, the rope stayed, the crowd dispersed, and the name of the woman on the gallows faded faster than her shadow. For many captured female pirates, the rope wasn't the beginning, it was the end of a long, public ritual of pain and humiliation. Before the scaffold, there was the square. Before the silence, there was the whip. Flogging was a favored punishment of the British Navy and colonial governors, particularly for those who didn't deserve the honor of execution. And for women, it was a spectacle, the weapon of choice. The cat-o'-nine-tails, a vicious whip with 9 knotted cords, each strike tearing flesh into ribbons. It didn't just hurt, it left marks that outlived memory. The condemned would be stripped, tied to a post or railing, surrounded by a crowd hungry for correction. Sometimes it was done in the dockyard, sometimes outside the prison gates, but it was always public. And when it was a woman, the violence became theater. Her cries weren't heard, they were swallowed by the noise. Her skin wasn't hers, it was a canvas of punishment, painted with blood, sweat, and salt air. Even before she died, her body had already been claimed by the state. This wasn't just about law, it was about power. To flog a woman in front of men, in front of her community, was to remind every spectator, this is what happens when you forget your place. There are no portraits of these women, no names etched into stone, only descriptions of what was done to them and where they bled. Before the noose, the Empire made sure they bled for the crowd. Not every captured female pirate was hanged. Some weren't even given that twisted form of closure. They were sold in the ports of Portobello, Cartagena, and across the West Indies. Women taken from pirate ships, especially those who were black, indigenous, or racially ambiguous, weren't seen as prisoners. They were seen as property. Colonial officials didn't care whether they were crew members, hostages, or leaders. The records blurred them into one word: spoils. Some were auctioned into forced labor, others were handed off as concubines, given to merchants, governors, or naval officers. There was no sentence, no trial, just a signature on a ledger. And then, silence. One day, a pirate with a sword, the next, a servant with no name. For these women, the punishment was not death, it was disappearance. No ballads were sung, no executions recorded, no graves dug. Their stories ended not with a rope, but with a closed door, and a world that never bothered to ask where they went, because to the Empire, erasing a woman was cleaner than killing her, and far more permanent. Some women were never hanged. They weren't whipped. They weren't sold. They were simply locked away and forgotten. The British called them prison hulks, old warships, stripped of sails, left to rot in harbors like Portsmouth, Plymouth, or Kingston, floating jails, floating graves, below deck. The air was thick with disease, rot, and rats. Shackles clinked in the dark. Flesh rotted from malnutrition, typhus, dysentery, smallpox. There was no escape. For women, it was worse. There were no protections, no medical care, and the few records that remain speak only in euphemisms. Unfit for transport, died awaiting sentence. Words that erase what really happened. Beatings, assault, starvation, silence. These women didn't die like pirates. They died like ghosts, below the waterline, under someone else's name, sometimes without a name at all. Their bodies were tossed into the sea or buried in unmarked pits. No stone, no service. Not even a line in the history books, because if no one saw them die, then no one would remember they ever lived. And that, for the Empire, was the perfect punishment. There are no graves for these women, no crosses by the shore, no markers at execution dock, only water and memory. And even that is fading. The Empire didn't need to kill every female pirate. It just needed us to forget them. No statues stand for Mary Critchett. No museum holds the chains of Bonny. No history book taught in school tells the names of those who died in prison ships, whipped into silence, or sold behind closed doors, because silence is the easiest execution, and forgetting is permanent. But the sea remembers. It remembers the screams that vanished beneath rising tides, the splinters of wood from the prison hulks, the smell of blood on a whipping post, and the last breath of a woman who dared to wear a pistol. We call them pirates, but they were rebels, outlaws, survivors, women who weren't supposed to exist and yet did. So ask yourself, what scared the Empire more? Women with swords, or women with freedom? Because if a man died a pirate, he became a legend. But if a woman died a pirate, she became a warning. And sometimes, the only difference between a story and a ghost is who gets to speak when it's over. Now, it's your turn. Do you think they were villains or victims of a world that feared them? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories that history tried to bury, subscribe. Because down here, in the dark corners of the past, the forgotten are never truly gone.